Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. Today what we thought we'd do is update our tier list since the meta has advanced a little bit. We've had a few more tournaments, a few more events means that we've got more data to work with, as well as we've had a few new cards brought in. We've had a new character being Mimi, as well as a couple of new cards including the Bunker Strike for the Dragon deck, which has mixed things up quite a bit. So what we thought we'd do is revisit this and see where we now think all of the decks lie. So let's just fire straight on in and go with what we know. So we're going to start out with Blue Falcon Formation. This is a bit of a weird deck. We started seeing people use Gaia the Fierce Knight in these builds, but this deck never really seems that competitive. The skill has too many restrictions on it, too many limitations. It forces you to basically try and use Gaia the Fierce Knight and Max Raider as your boss monsters, which are just not good enough realistically. The skill effect is actually pretty good. Minusing 800 attack or something is decent, but that's only really good when you're attacking into them, whereas you could just use something like a 7-0 Magician and just boost over anyway, so reducing it by 800 doesn't do a ton, unfortunately, especially when you're forced to use a bunch of very mediocre boss monsters. So we're going to put this in Rogue. Originally we had this in tier 3, but I think we were being a bit too generous then. We hadn't, again, seen what all of the decks could do. It was still very fresh, still very new, but now after playing it a ton, it's definitely a rogue deck. It can still take games, you have to get a little bit lucky for it to come off. The next up on the list, we have the Warrior deck. So originally we had this in tier 1. I do think it has slipped a little bit. This deck still does place well. We have seen a few tournaments recently where it's still topping. It's not winning anything though, unfortunately. The main problem this deck seems to have is that a lot of other cards just kind of hard counter it. We've seen 7's Axel Road spellcasters just don't really care about this. They play a bunch of level 6 monsters, so that Yami Ruler lock just doesn't do anything to them. They also have access to 7's Road Witch, which can cheat out the 7's Road Magician, so you can get out a 7 even under the Yami lock, and that is something that the Dragon caster lists have also started doing. Being able to play under the lock is kind of frustrating, because that means the lock, if you're not locking your opponent out of playing the game, then the Warrior deck just feels a bit lackluster, because at that point you're just trying to cheaply find a win wherever you can by attacking directly with Kime Ruler or just using Pierce to just get that little bit of damage wherever you can. It doesn't help as well that the new Aqua deck, which has been not performing great but has been doing okay, we have seen a decent amount of representation, does have a lot of life gain, which again this deck really does not like. The Dark Solarity Warrior deck really wants to just try and get to your opponent's life points quickly and kind of bypass their monsters to do it, and life point gain can really hurt this. The other problem is that the Dragon deck with the new Bunker Strike has been seeing a lot of rise in popularity and has been doing really well. Because of that, it also hurts this deck, because this deck gets hard countered by that Dragon deck. The reason for that being that Dragonic Pressure just wipes the board and therefore you get to play under it, as well as the fact they're playing Gravity Press Dragon, which is a level 6 that just gets under it. So again, it has a lot of bad matchups, and I suppose that also worth mentioning, Fire Golem is another decent counter to this deck. A lot of the decks that struggle to get over it, things like just end on a Dragius board, if your opponent then summons out their Yami Ruler and changes it to defense, you can just summon out a Fire Golem and weaken it and get through that way. So just a lot of things are going wrong for this deck, so it's in a bit of a struggle streak at the moment, but still very playable, still very strong, still a tier 2 deck. So next up we have Dragon's Grace Dragons. So this is a bit of a funky list. This is basically just Dragius Beatdown, but it does play the Dragon Sage to use the skill to give Dragius a little bit of a boost. It's fine. Basically, if you're just playing Dragius in a deck that can just run just beaters, it's a fine deck. Being able to give your Dragius a little bit of a boost is fine. This isn't the best Dragius deck by any stretch, but it's definitely not rogue. This is probably a tier 3 deck, just because, again, if you're playing Dragius in your deck, you're not a rogue deck. You're playing the best card in the format, therefore, it's okay. In the very worst case scenario, just being able to summon Dragius and just smash 2 things out the way, get inflated damage, is always going to be really good. Next up, we have our Dragons. Now, originally we had this top of tier 2, and I think we're going to put it back in top of tier 2 again. I don't think this is quite tier 1. It's very close to tier 1, I will say. It just feels like it's not quite on the same level as the 2 better decks that we'll talk about in a minute. But it's still very good. Bunker Strike has really sorted this deck out. Before, when we had to run 3 copies of the Dragonic Slayer, it felt very lackluster. A lot of the time, you weren't really hitting any back row because people aren't really playing much back row. So Dragonic Slayer ended up feeling like it was a vanilla. And because of that, it felt very poor. With the introduction of Bunker Strike, you can now dig out all of those very important cards. You can sort out your hand for next turn. You can find the Dragonic Pressures that you need to try and do your little combo. Because this deck does have a very interesting little combo, where if you can set a Dragonic Pressure on a prior turn, get both Pitcher and Slugger into your graveyard, then on a following turn, you can activate the pressure, discard 3 dragons, wipe the board, bring back either Slugger or Pitcher, use the effect to bring back the other one. You still have 2 cards in hand, which means you contribute both of your monsters to summon out, let's say, a Bunker Strike or a Dragonic Slayer, and then you can also summon out a Dragorite. This is obviously the perfect card, but it doesn't have to be Dragorite. At which point you have a 23 and a 15. Then using the skill, you can add 500 to both of them, putting them to 28 and 2000, and the skill also boosts the Dragorite's level so that it's now above level 6, which means it can attack, because usually you can't because of the Slugger Pitcher combo. But this means you can get at your opponent for 4,800. This is the danger zone, which is why if you're ever against a dragon player that has a set back row and has the graveyard set up, and you're at 4,800 or lower life points, you should be worried. But again, this deck still does crumble a lot of the time. It's definitely a good deck. It's definitely very, very strong. It's probably the 3rd strongest deck in the game at the moment. I just think it is just a slight step underneath the better decks. And speaking of those better decks, Dragoncasters. Dragoncasters is the best pile of cards that you can get. Dragoncasters is quite literally, we're going to take 3 Multi-Strike Dragon Dragius, we're going to take 3 Seven's Road Magician, and we're just going to slap all the other generic good cards in one big pile and have it beat everyone's face in. And it is very, very strong. It's very, very reliable. We've seen this deck topping constantly. This is a menace on the ladder. It's very easy to play. It's winning tournaments. It's coming 2nd place in tournaments. It's coming top 8, top 4 in tournaments constantly. This deck is just absolutely everywhere. Dragius, in a vacuum, again, is the most powerful card in the game, and probably the best backup for it is the Seven's Road Magician. Being able to boost your attack to ridiculous levels is always going to be really, really useful, as well as the fact that spellcasters do get a few extra tools that they can use, such as the Mystic Dealer to try and sort out your hand, as well as the Stray Familiar, which is another one of those cards you can set on one turn, flip over on another turn, and then basically gain advantage later on, as well as putting your very high value cards back in the deck to be used later on, such as the Seven's Road Magician. So again, very, very powerful deck, very, very strong, and definitely a tier 1 deck. Next up, we have this is Noodle aggro, I guess, is the way to describe this. So I actually did enter a tournament with this, and I did make top 8. Didn't quite manage to do much more than that, because again, this is definitely a tier 3 deck. It's one of those situations, again, where it's Dragius beat down the deck with something else in it. And the something else in this case is Spice the Elite Noodle Ninja, and Stock the other Noodle Ninja. The basic idea behind this deck is that you play Spice instead of the Seven's Road Magician, and then you basically just play all of the 1500 vanillas, because Spice's effect only specifies that you have to have non-effect normal monsters in your graveyard to get it off. The other benefit is that if the game does go very late, you can boost his attack by quite a substantial amount, as well as Stock, who has 1000 attack base, but if you can boost both of them up by 1200, 1500, suddenly you get 2 very, very large monsters. The other benefit is that if you do get out 2 copies of Spice, they can boost each other. If you get out 2 Spice and a Stock, you can then boost all 3 of them to ridiculously high numbers, and you can just close out games with it. So it's very free-to-play friendly as well, so it's quite a nice little deck, but if you're looking for something different but that can still win games, I highly recommend it. It's very, very fun to play, but again, doesn't have the same bite as the decks above it, so still just going to be a tier 3 deck. Next up, we have our other kind of fire Noodle deck. So this deck is actually using the Noodle skill, Noodle Art Boost, which is okay. The main problem this deck has is that you can only play monsters that have 2400 or less attack, which means we can't play things like Dragius in it, which does hurt it a little bit, but in exchange we do get to use the Noodle skill, which isn't great. So one face at level 5 or higher monster that was normal summon this turn, or one face at Pyro type monster with 1300 less attack on your field gains 400 attack to the end of the turn. 400 attack is not a ton, which is a bit disappointing. In order to use this skill, we have to have so many deck restrictions, which is basically forcing us to play kind of Spice and Folder Blitz Beatdown, and all we're getting for our troubles is 400 attack, which is not a great deal. This deck is fine. It's like a little bit better than Rogue. We have seen it doing okay in some tournaments, but it's nothing special. It's nothing great, and I don't think we're going to see this like winning anything anytime soon. Next up, we have Psychics. Now, unfortunately, Psychics is in a bit of a weird spot. I really, really like this deck. It's very, very fun to play. And again, it does pop off harder than almost any other deck. It is able to just kill your opponent out of nowhere if everything goes right. It has a pretty good control game as well, in the sense that you can just keep getting spells every turn with the skill, Climax Finale, and basically keep flipping your opponent's monsters down or keep boosting attack. The problem this deck has is, again, its monsters are a little bit weak, and you're paying life points left and right, which can put you into the danger zone quite frequently, and not just against the dragons, against kind of everyone. So, although this deck does have actual spells and traps that it can play, although this deck can pop off harder than any other deck, it is actually kind of very difficult to play and not just kill yourself, and getting wins with it can be quite challenging. That's why we're going to put it in tier 3, because again, if it does high roll, it can just blow you out. If it doesn't high roll, it just kind of crumbles and doesn't get to do anything. Next up, we have Aggro. So Aggro, this is just kind of the pile of cards. This is very similar to the Spice version of the deck, but this is just with Prima Katana instead of Spice, and instead of using stock, we're just playing more kind of generic cards. The deck is fine. The main issue the deck has is that it really struggles to deal with Yami Ruler. It doesn't have the same tools that a lot of the other decks have to get rid of it, which means a lot of the time you'll just run into a Yami Ruler, you won't have what you need to out it, which a lot of the time is going to be either an already set up board, or again, already have a Dragius out and then get out a Fire Golem is kind of the best out you have to it. So it's a little bit struggle shit because of that, but as we start to see less and less Dark Solarity Warriors, we might start to see a little bit more of the aggro. This was a very, very strong deck at the very beginning of Rush Duel Links, but has since fallen off quite a bit, but it's still a decent tier 3 deck, definitely can still take games. Next up, we have Sevens Axel Road Spellcasters, probably, I would say, the strongest deck in the game still. It's very, very good. The deck, again, plays a lot of level 6s. Because of that, it's very consistent. Sometimes you will just open a hand of just all level 6 monsters, and you'll be like, well, I can't do anything, the game's over. But that's fine, because in a tournament setting, it won't matter as much because you're playing in a best of 3. So if you do brick here and there, as long as you don't get very, very unlucky and brick 2 games in a row, it's very, very strong. This deck is able to just summon out Seven's Road Magician pretty much constantly. It's able to boost monsters' attack up to ridiculous heights. Because of the skill being able to give 800 attack to your level 6 monsters, you can do quite a lot. If you use it on a Seven's Road Witch, that will boost up to 24, and then using its own effect, cheat out the Seven's Road Magician, it goes up to 28. So you'll be there with a potential 3900 attack Seven's Road Magician and a 2800 attack Seven's Road Witch, which is very, very powerful. If you use it on Splat, again, you can boost up to 24, then use Splat's own effect on itself to put it up to 26, which is also very, very relevant. That outs Yami Ruler, that outs Dragius, very, very important number to hit. Unfortunately, Torna can't really get much benefit out of this, only goes up to 24, but again, Torna can out most things just by changing the battle position, it just doesn't deal with Yami Ruler. This deck is very, very powerful, very, very consistent, and I think that is the most important thing here. It is one of the most consistent decks in the game, probably followed by the Dragons and their Dragonic Resonance. But other than that, just incredible. Again, winning tournaments left and right. I've won a tournament with this deck. It is so good, so powerful. Next up, we have Curse of the Dark Dragons. So this deck utilizes Dragon Knight of Darkness with the Curse of the Dark skill. So Curse of the Dark is one face-up dark attribute normal monster on your field that was normal summon this turn, gains 500 attack to the end of the turn. Then if you're selected Dragon Knight of Darkness, you can return one card from your hand to the deck. If you do, it gains 700 attack as long as it's face-up. So it means it will gain a permanent 700 attack, which is okay. That put up to 2300 attack, which is not great, but it's fine, right? You're a Gaia the Fierce Knight, you're a Dragonic Slayer, you're a Bunker Strike. On the turn you summon it, however, it does go up to 28, which is pretty good. The only problem I have with this is why wouldn't you just play the normal Dragon deck and just make your Bunker Strike anyway? Just summon it out as a 23, Dragonic Resonance will make it a 28, and it has a skill. It just seems poor, right? It's not a very strong deck. It is kind of funny to use, but I think the skill could do with a buff if we're actually going to make it anything like relevant. Because again, it does also limit you to just playing Dragius and then a bunch of normal dragons. So not great, still kind of funny, definitely a rogue deck. Next up, we have Beatdown, or Diabolic King Beetle. This deck is pretty good, actually. I'm going to put it here, I think. We originally thought this deck was a bit of a meme, but using the Tribute Boost skill and being able to boost Dragius's attack is actually very, very relevant. And because it is a level 6, it can somewhat play under Yami Ruler. It's nothing crazy, it's still a tier 3 deck. It's nothing that's gonna like win tournaments necessarily, and I think it could actually win tournaments. We've definitely seen a few of these decks top a lot. It just hasn't quite managed to take it yet. But very, very interesting. The major weakness is always going to be you have to run a bunch of level 1s. And level 1s are really bad for pushing, they're really bad for getting damage in, they're very good for being very passive. And because of the way defense points work in Rush, a lot of the time your monsters are going to cap out at 1400 defense, and monsters are going to have 1500 attack, which means most of the time your guys are going to get run over, unless you're against specific matchups where they have to run specific types and then they have a lot lower attack monsters. So Diabolic King Beetle, improved, still room for improvement, but better than it was and doing pretty okay. Next up, Dark Magician. So Dark Magician is a weird one. I think it's probably not in Rogue, just because being able to get 3 Summon Skulls in your deck is actually not that bad. It's not great, right? Let's not kid ourselves. It's bottom of tier 3, just above Rogue. But it can take games. It just doesn't do anything special. Its party trick is, I now have 3 Summon Skulls in my deck. And that is where the deck ends. That's all it does. Beyond that, you're probably going to have 7's Rogue Magician in the deck, and that's kind of it. The skill does help this deck out a lot, and this deck might actually start seeing some play when we get 1000 Knives, being able to remove monsters when you can guarantee that you have access to your Dark Magician. Could be pretty good, but for now, struggle street a little bit. Next up, Lightning Volt Condor. So this is probably somewhere around here. It's a bit awkward to place. I think anything that's just beating things up with Dragius, and again, Diabolic King Beetle is also a beat things up with Dragius deck, is going to do better than this deck. It requires a lot of work to make its combo come off, and doesn't offer much in the way of facilitating that. Now, the skill makes this deck a thing. Without the skill, Lightning Volt Condor is just completely garbage. But you kind of have to hope that the stars align, that everything goes exactly how you need to. The one benefit this deck really does have is that because Dragius is a light monster, you should be running 3 copies of Lightning Volt Condor in this deck anyway, which means if you do discard a Lightning Volt Condor, you don't even have to change Dragius to a light monster, which means you can use the skill on something else and hopefully just blitz their entire board down, which can work out. But again, just the amount of effort required to pull the combo off of weakening all your opponent's monsters and then trying to summon out 3 monsters of your own that can actually contest it. Again, the deck building restrictions force you into just spellcasters and wing beasts, so it's very restrictive. The combo can win games, it can be very fun, not very consistent, not great overall. So bottom of tier 3. So next up we have Explosion Drive. So we're going to put this as top of Rogue. That is because this is a bit of a funky one. So can only be used if the only monsters in your deck are spellcasters and rocks. That's already quite a harsh restriction. Now spellcasters are great, rocks not so much. This turn, one face-up fire attribute monster on your field gains 500 attack and its level is increased by 1. Then you can set Road Magic Explosion from your hand in your spell and trap card zone. If you do, add 1 fire attribute monster with 800 defense or less from your graveyard to your hand. So being able to get cards back to your hand is fine. Being able to recycle full Meteor Impact is okay, I guess. Road Magic Explosion, again, is a bit of a weird one. If you have a face-up level 7 or higher spellcaster monster on your field, which again is basically just going to be 7's Road Magician, send 1 fire attribute monster from your hand to the graveyard. Inflict damage to your opponent equals the number of cards on their field times 400. Now the reason this really sucks at the moment is because people aren't typically playing a ton of back row, which means you're basically hitting them for about 1200, which is fine, but it's not great. I think when people start playing a lot more back row, this might be a bit better, but at which point the card quality probably will have increased, the amount of skills will have gone up, which means this card might just get left behind anyway. So I don't expect too much from it, but I guess it's fine. Next up, we have Aquas. I think I'm actually going, and I didn't think I'd be doing this, I'm going to put Aquas at top of tier 3. Aquas have really outperformed my expectations. I really thought that Aquas, after looking at them, were going to be a bit mid. We've been seeing people have a lot of success using Disco Fever, which I was using for a little bit, but came to the conclusion that it wasn't really that great. Being able to boost your D and Keto's attack is fine, but not being able to boost like your Canaan next to it felt a bit weak. but people have been seeing some okay success with this. I personally prefer the skill that lets you add D and Keto and Seahorse to hand, but it's been doing okay. More often than not, it is the Seahorse carriers carrying the deck, because those are still very, very good. We're seeing them splashed in a ton of different decks right now, including the Dragoncaster list, so that's a very, very powerful individual card. This deck on its own, it seems to have legs. Again, more legs than I thought it was going to have, so it's been doing okay. We've seen it topping some events as well, which is very surprising from my point of view, so it's got to be doing something right. And then finally, we're going to put this on top of Rogue. This is Stool. So this deck, I haven't run into very much, but whenever I have, it's been very frustrating to play against. It's not really got much of a game plan outside of slow the game down to a crawl. You play a 40 card deck, you just use Yami Ruler and D and Keto to try and stall up the game as long as possible, keep gaining life points whenever you can, stop your opponent from being able to play the game, and then hopefully just deck them out. And that is basically the entire game plan. It's not very fun to play against, and I haven't lost to it that much, so I think we've bumped it down to Rogue. Originally when I did lose to it, I felt like, oh my god, this deck could be something really, really bad. But again, it does lose to a lot of the decks up here. Seven's XL Rogue just kind of beats it up. Dragoncasters have an okay matchup into it. The Dragon deck just straight up beats it because Dragonic Pressure is a card. Even Yami Ruler itself is a good counter to Yami Ruler, who would have thought? So because of that, I think it's being pushed down the list quite a lot. And with that, I think that comes to the end of this tier list. I think that is pretty much where we think everything goes. I don't think we want to, I mean, maybe we move some of tier 3 around a little bit. Maybe the order of Rogue gets moved around, but I'm quite confident about these top 4 up here. We're in a pretty okay meta right now. And if you're a big fan of 7's Red Magician, you're eating pretty. If you're a big fan of Dragius, again, it's looking quite good for you. So overall, I think this is about where things land at the moment. Fingers crossed, though, that we do get to spice this up a little bit when we get more product release. We haven't had anything announced just yet, but fingers crossed we get something really cool. The latest card we've got was Harpy Lady, which again hasn't really done anything. We weren't expecting that card to do anything anyway, though. But when we get some new characters, when we get the new box, we're expecting this to get shaken up quite a lot. Fingers crossed it's just not these 4 decks at the top again, because that might be a bit boring. Anyway, thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.